The lobby of Callaway Tower rose 60 stories into a gray morning sky, its floors polished to a mirror shine that reflected the chandeliers hanging far above like frozen stars. Arthur pushed through the revolving doors holding his son's small hand, and the cold hush of the place seemed to swallow the sound of the city behind them. He was dressed the way he always dressed on ordinary days, a faded gray jacket with a small tear at the cuff, jeans that had been washed so many times they'd gone soft and pale, sneakers with the tread worn smooth. Beside him, 6-year-old Leo wore a jacket 2 sizes too big, the sleeves rolled at the wrist, his eyes wide and darting across the vast marble expanse like he'd just stepped into a palace from one of his storybooks. "Stay close, buddy," Arthur said quietly, giving Leo's hand a gentle squeeze. "This is a big building. Lots of important people work here." "Are you an important person, Dad?" Leo asked, craning his neck to look up at the ceiling. Arthur smiled, the kind of small, private smile that didn't reach his eyes because there was too much history behind it. "I'm your dad. That's the only important thing I need to be." They made their way toward the security desk, where a guard glanced up, taking in Arthur's clothes with the practiced, dismissive speed of someone who had learned to sort visitors into categories before they even spoke. "Can I help you?" the guard asked, his tone flat. "I have a meeting," Arthur said simply, and gave a name and a floor number. The guard's eyebrows lifted a fraction, surprised, but he waved them through without further comment, more out of habit than curiosity. Arthur didn't explain further. He never did. He had learned a long time ago that the truth of who he was and what he owned meant less to him than the truth of who he was raising his son to be. Leo tugged at his hand. "Can I look at the fountain, Dad? Please? Just for a second?" Near the center of the lobby, a broad stone fountain bubbled quietly, ringed by potted plants and a few low benches where visitors waited. Arthur checked his watch. They had a few minutes before his meeting. "Okay, but stay right where I can see you." Leo darted off, delighted, weaving between a pair of men in suits deep in conversation, his sneakers squeaking faintly against the marble. Arthur watched him go, that familiar mixture of love and worry in his chest, the feeling that never quite left him no matter how many boardrooms he'd sat in or how many empires he'd built and dismantled. None of it mattered as much as this. His son, laughing, chasing the reflection of light on water. It happened fast, the way small disasters always do. Leo, giggling, spun around to call something back to his father and collided with a woman walking briskly across the lobby, her heels clicking in urgent rhythm against the stone. She'd been looking down at her phone, thumb flying across the screen, and the impact knocked her sideways, half a step. A few drops from the paper coffee cup in her other hand splashed onto the toe of her shoe, a shoe that, judging by the sheen of the leather and the sharp, unmistakable red sole, cost more than most people's monthly rent. Leo stumbled back, wide-eyed. "I'm sorry," he said immediately, in the small, automatic voice of a child who has been taught manners before almost anything else. The woman looked down at her shoe first. Then she looked at Leo. Her name was Veronica Hale, and she was by any measure the business world used a phenomenon. She had built her company from a single struggling boutique retail brand into a sprawling international conglomerate over the course of 15 relentless years, and she wore that history like armor, sharp tailored blazers, a watch worth more than a car, a reputation that preceded her into every room she entered. She had not built any of it by being soft. She had built it by being merciless, and by making sure everyone around her knew, at every possible moment, exactly how far she had climbed and exactly how far beneath her most people stood. "Do you have any idea," she said, her voice rising, sharp enough to cut through the ambient hum of the lobby, "how much these shoes cost?" Leo shrank back, his lower lip trembling. "I didn't mean to. Clearly nobody's taught you to watch where you're going," Veronica snapped, cutting him off. She glanced around theatrically, as if searching for whoever was responsible for this small, grubby child now standing in her way. "Is there an adult with you? Or did you just wander in off the street?" The word landed like a slap. A few nearby visitors turned to look, sensing the shift in the air the way people always do when something is about to go wrong in public. Arthur was already moving. He crossed the lobby in a few long strides, and placed himself gently but firmly between Veronica and his son, one hand resting protectively on Leo's shoulder. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice calm, low, controlled. "He didn't mean to bump into you. He's 6. Veronica's eyes swept over Arthur, the frayed jacket, the faded jeans, the scuffed sneakers, with the particular, practiced contempt of someone who had spent years learning to read a person's net worth from their shoes alone. Something in her expression curdled further, as if his apology had only confirmed a suspicion she'd already formed. "Of course he is," she said, a short, humorless laugh escaping her. "Filthy little thing, running wild through my building like it's a playground. Is this how you raise children? Letting them loose to ruin other people's property? There's no need for that," Arthur said, still calm, though something had tightened at the corner of his jaw. "It was an accident. A little water on your shoe. I'll gladly cover the cleaning, if that would help." "Cleaning?" Veronica repeated, and now the laugh came again, longer this time, cruel in its ease. She looked him up and down once more, slower, deliberately, letting the silence stretch so that everyone nearby could watch her do it. "Sweetheart, these shoes cost more than I imagine you make in 3 months. I doubt you could cover cleaning them, let alone replacing them if they're ruined." A few people near the fountain had stopped pretending not to watch. Leo pressed himself against his father's leg, small and silent, his earlier delight completely gone, replaced by the particular hurt of a child who understands, even without knowing all the words for it, that he's just been humiliated in front of strangers. "You don't need to speak to him that way," Arthur said, and though his voice never rose, there was something in it now, a current of steel beneath the calm. "He's a child. He apologized. That should be the end of it. Should it?" Veronica tilted her head, amused now, the way a cat is amused by something small and cornered. "And who exactly are you to tell me what should or shouldn't be the end of anything? Do you know whose building this is? Whose name is on the deed, on the elevators, on every floor above your head right now?" She spread her arms slightly, taking in the vast lobby, the soaring ceiling, the gleaming reception desk, as though presenting her kingdom for inspection. "I own this. All of it. I built this from nothing with my own 2 hands, while people like you were busy failing at whatever it is people like you do. So don't stand there in your thrift store jacket and lecture me about manners." A ripple of uncomfortable silence spread through the lobby. Somewhere behind the reception desk, a young employee winced and looked away, clearly wishing she were anywhere else. Arthur's hand tightened, just slightly, on Leo's shoulder, though his face remained impossibly composed. "I think you've made your point," he said quietly. "We'll go." But Veronica wasn't finished. Something about his composure seemed to needle her further, as though his refusal to grovel was itself an insult. She snapped her fingers, sharp and imperious, toward the security desk. 2 guards, who had been watching the scene unfold with the particular helplessness of men, paid too little to intervene in the affairs of the woman who signed their checks, straightened immediately. "Escort this man and his child out of my building," Veronica said, her voice carrying easily across the lobby now, pitched for an audience. "And make sure the front desk flags them. I don't want to see either of them back here. Ever." "Ma'am, that's really not necessary," one of the guards began, but she cut him off with a look that could have frozen the fountain solid. "Did I ask for your opinion?" Leo had begun to cry. Quietly, the kind of crying children do when they're trying very hard not to, tears sliding down his face as he buried it against his father's side. Arthur crouched immediately, ignoring everyone else in the lobby, and gathered his son into his arms, murmuring something low and soothing that no one else could hear. For a moment, nothing else in the world existed to him except the small, shaking shoulders under his hands. When he stood again, something had changed in his face. The calm was still there, but it had hardened into something else entirely. The stillness of a man who has stopped trying to be reasonable with someone who has no interest in reason. He reached into the inside pocket of his worn jacket and withdrew a phone. It looked at first glance unremarkable, sleek and black, but anyone who worked in technology would have recognized it instantly as a device that did not yet exist on any shelf, in any store, anywhere in the world. A prototype, one of perhaps a dozen in existence. Veronica noticed it too, though she mistook its significance entirely. "Oh, what? Are you calling a lawyer?" she said, delighted, clapping a hand to her chest in mock alarm. "Please, go ahead. Call whoever you'd like. I have several on retainer who would be thrilled to remind you exactly how little standing a man in your position has against me." Arthur didn't answer her. He simply lifted the phone to his ear, his eyes steady on hers, and said a single name into the receiver, followed by 4 quiet words. "Do it." Effective immediately. Then he ended the call, slid the phone back into his pocket, and knelt to pick up the small backpack Leo had dropped during the commotion, as unbothered as a man ordering coffee. The 2 guards exchanged an uncertain glance, but began to approach anyway, following orders they clearly no longer wanted to follow. Veronica watched with satisfaction, arms crossed, chin lifted, savoring what she assumed was the final word. That was when her phone began to ring. She glanced down, irritated at the interruption to her moment of triumph, and frowned at the name on the screen. Her chief financial officer, a man who never called her directly during business hours unless something had gone catastrophically wrong. She almost let go to voicemail. Then, behind her, the elevator doors chimed open, and 3 members of her executive board stepped out into the lobby, all of them already on their own phones, all of them wearing the same expression of pale, urgent alarm. "Veronica," her CFO said the moment she answered, his voice tight and clipped in a way she had never heard from him before. "We have a serious problem. I need you upstairs right now." "What kind of problem?" she asked, though something cold had already begun to uncoil in her stomach. "Someone just executed a hostile acquisition. A controlling stake, 51%, purchased in the last 4 minutes at double market value. The board is scrambling. Legal is already on it." "Veronica, it's done. It's already done." The color drained slowly from her face. "That's impossible. Nobody has that kind of capital lined up without months of filings, without—" "It's confirmed," he said, cutting her off, something almost like fear in his voice now. "The transfer went through the exchange 3 minutes ago. Whoever did this didn't need months. They had the capital sitting ready. Veronica, you need to come upstairs. Now." She lowered the phone slowly, her hand trembling almost imperceptibly, and turned to look at Arthur, who was standing exactly where he had been, calmly buttoning Leo's jacket against the chill of the air conditioning, as though nothing of consequence had happened at all. "What did you do?" she whispered. Arthur straightened, lifting Leo into his arms, the boy's tear-streaked face now resting against his father's shoulder, calmer now, soothed by his father's steady presence. "I told you," he said quietly. "You don't need to speak to a child that way. I gave you the chance to apologize. You chose this instead. Who are you?" Her voice had lost all of its earlier command, reduced now to something thin and disbelieving. "My name is Arthur Voss," he said simply, and watched the recognition strike her like a physical blow. The name meant nothing to the general public. He had spent years, deliberately, methodically, making sure of that, operating behind a web of holding companies and silent partnerships that kept his name off headlines and away from magazine covers. But to anyone who understood the true architecture of global finance, to anyone who had ever traced the quiet, patient hand behind a dozen of the decade's largest and most successful acquisitions, the name Arthur Voss was not unknown. It was legendary, whispered in boardrooms with a mixture of respect and unease, precisely because so few people had ever seen his face. "That's not possible," Veronica breathed. "Arthur Voss is a myth, a ghost investor. Nobody's ever confirmed." "I prefer to work quietly," Arthur said. "It tends to attract less attention from people who judge a man by his jacket instead of his judgment." He shifted Leo slightly in his arms and glanced toward the elevator, where the 3 board members stood frozen, watching the scene with dawning, horrified understanding. "As of 4 minutes ago, I hold controlling interest in this company, which means as of 4 minutes ago, every decision made under this roof runs through me. You can't. This is—" Veronica's composure, so absolute only minutes before, had entirely collapsed, replaced by something raw and panicked. "This is insane. You can't just walk in here and buy a company because I was rude to your kid. You didn't just insult me," Arthur said, and for the first time, Something colder slipped into his voice, something that made even the security guards take an involuntary step back. You humiliated a 6-year-old boy in front of a room full of strangers because he spilled a drop of water on your shoes. You ordered him thrown out onto the street like garbage. I have built and unbuilt companies for a great many reasons in my life, Ms. Hale, but I have never once regretted doing it for this one. The lobby had gone utterly silent now. Every visitor, every employee, every passerby frozen in place, watching the collapse of an empire unfold in real time under the very chandeliers Veronica had once boasted about owning. "Please," she said, and the word came out smaller than she intended, stripped of all its earlier arrogance. "There has to be something we can discuss. Some arrangement. I built this company from nothing. 15 years of my life. And I respect the work it took to build something from nothing," Arthur said, and there was no cruelty in his voice now, only a flat, unshakable finality. "I understand it better than you might think. But a company is only as good as the values of the person running it, and I have just watched, firsthand, exactly what your values are." He turned slightly toward the board members still standing by the elevator. "Ms. Hale's employment with this company is terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort her out. I'd like her badge and building access revoked before the end of the hour." "You can't do this," Veronica said again, though the protest had lost all its force, reduced now to something close to pleading. "Security works for me. This building works for me now," Arthur finished quietly. He nodded once toward the two guards, who had been standing frozen through the entire exchange, clearly unsure whose orders they were meant to be following anymore. "Please see Ms. Hale to the door. Gently. She's had a difficult morning." The guards exchanged a brief, uncertain glance, and then, slowly, unmistakably, turned toward Veronica instead of toward Arthur. It was such a small gesture, but it landed with the full weight of everything it represented. The same men who had, minutes earlier, moved to throw a father and his child out onto the street on her command now stood ready to do the same to her. "This isn't over," Veronica said, backing away, her voice cracking under the pressure of a reality she was only beginning to comprehend. "I'll fight this. In court, in the press, everywhere. You'll regret this." "Perhaps," Arthur said evenly, "but I doubt it." He glanced down at Leo, who had lifted his head from his father's shoulder and was watching the unfolding scene with the wide, uncomprehending eyes of a child witnessing something far larger than himself. "Say goodbye to the nice lady, Leo." Leo, still sniffling slightly, looked at Veronica for a long moment. He didn't say anything cruel, didn't gloat the way an adult might have in his place. He simply said, in the small, honest voice of a child who had already forgiven more than the situation probably deserved, "I'm still sorry about your shoe." Something in Veronica's face broke at that, not with anger this time, but with something closer to shame, the sudden, dizzying realization of exactly how small her own cruelty looked next to a child's easy grace. She said nothing. She had nothing left to say. The guard stepped forward, not roughly, but firmly, and guided her toward the door she had once walked through as the undisputed queen of everything around her. The lobby remained silent as she went, dozens of eyes following her all the way to the revolving doors, through them, and out onto the sidewalk beyond, where she stood for a long moment in the gray morning light, blinking, as if she couldn't quite believe the building had spit her out onto the street like any other stranger. Inside, Arthur turned to the three board members still waiting by the elevator, their expressions a careful blend of shock and calculation, already beginning to understand what this new chapter might mean for them. "I want a full meeting with department heads by end of day," he said, his voice returning to its earlier, unhurried calm. "Nothing drastic. I have no interest in dismantling what good work has been done here. I only intend to make sure it's led by someone who understands that power is a responsibility, not a weapon." One of the board members, an older woman with sharp eyes and the weathered patience of someone who had survived several regime changes in her career, allowed herself the ghost of a smile. "It'll be an honor to work with you, Mr. Voss." "Arthur is fine," he said. He glanced down at Leo again, who had finally stopped crying entirely and was now looking around the lobby with cautious, returning curiosity, as though testing whether it was safe to be delighted by the chandeliers again. Right now, though, I have a meeting of my own to get to, with someone far more important than any of you. He carried Leo toward the elevator, past the fountain where the whole incident had begun only minutes before, the water still bubbling gently, indifferent to everything that had just unfolded around it. As the elevator doors slid closed, Leo peeked over his father's shoulder at the lobby, shrinking away below, at the stunned faces of strangers still standing frozen in place, and asked, in the innocent, curious voice of a child, already moving on to his next question, "Dad, are we still going to get ice cream after your meeting?" Arthur laughed, low and warm, all the earlier coldness melting instantly away, replaced by the only thing that had ever really mattered to him in that lobby or any other. "Yes, buddy," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of his son's head as the elevator rose. "We're still getting ice cream." Outside, on the sidewalk, Veronica stood alone in the cold morning air, watching her own reflection in the glass doors of the building that no longer belonged to her, and understood for the first time in 15 years exactly how small the world could make a person feel when kindness had never been part of the climb. By the time the story of what happened in the Callaway Tower lobby made its way through the whispered channels of the business world, the humiliated child, the quiet father, the phone call that toppled an empire in minutes, it had already become something of a legend, retold with a kind of hushed astonishment by everyone who had witnessed it firsthand. People who had never met Arthur Voss began to speak his name with a new kind of caution, understanding at last why the man had spent so many years cultivating anonymity. Not because he had something to hide, but because he had never needed the world to know who he was in order to know exactly who he was. Weeks later, the company under its new leadership announced a series of changes that rippled quietly through its culture. Reforms to how employees were treated, new policies protecting the dignity of every person who walked through its doors, regardless of what they wore or how much money sat in their accounts. Arthur never spoke publicly about the takeover, never gave interviews, never allowed his name to be attached to the story in any official capacity. He simply returned to his usual quiet life, running his invisible empire from behind the scenes, showing up to school recitals in the same faded jacket, packing the same simple lunches, teaching his son the same lessons about humility and grace that he had lived by his entire life. As for Veronica, her fall from grace became a cautionary tale in business circles for years afterward, a story told to young executives about the dangers of arrogance, the fragility of power built on cruelty rather than character. She eventually resurfaced in a much smaller venture, chastened, quieter, though whether the lesson truly took root in her or simply taught her better manners in public remained something only she would ever know. And somewhere in the city, in a modest apartment far from the marble lobbies and glass towers he so quietly controlled, Arthur tucked his son into bed that night, the same as every night, and answered without hesitation the question Leo asked him as his eyes grew heavy with sleep. "Dad, was that lady going to be okay?" Arthur considered the question for a long moment, brushing the hair back from his son's forehead. "I hope so, buddy," he said finally. "Everybody deserves the chance to learn how to be kind. Some people just need a harder lesson than others. Like the one you gave her? Something like that." Arthur smiled, switching off the lamp, leaving only the soft glow of the hallway light spilling through the cracked door. "But the most important lesson of all, Leo, isn't the one I gave her today. It's the one I hope you never forget. It doesn't matter how much money someone has, or how important they seem, or how big their building is. What matters is how they treat the people who can't do anything for them in return. That's the only measure that's ever meant anything to me." Leo, already half asleep, murmured something that might have been agreement, and within moments his breathing evened out into the steady rhythm of a child's untroubled sleep, safe and warm and entirely unaware of just how much power his father had wielded on his behalf that morning, or how little that power had ever mattered to Arthur compared to the small, sleepy weight of his son's hand in his own. Arthur sat there for a while longer than usual that night, watching the rise and fall of his son's chest in the dim light, turning the day over in his mind the way he turned over every decision that mattered. He had not enjoyed what he'd done in that lobby. There was no triumph in it for him. No satisfaction in watching a woman's composure crumble in front of a crowd of strangers. No pleasure in the swift, surgical efficiency with which he had dismantled 15 years of someone else's ambition. He had done it because the alternative, walking away, swallowing the humiliation, teaching his son that cruelty simply had to be endured because the person delivering it wore the right shoes, was a lesson he refused to let take root in the boy sleeping so peacefully beside him. He thought of his own father, a quiet man who had worked with his hands his whole life and never once raised his voice, who had taught him that dignity wasn't something you were born with or bought, but something you built moment by moment in a way you treated the people who could never repay you for your kindness. Arthur had carried that lesson through every boardroom he'd ever entered, through every merger and acquisition, through the long, careful years of building an empire that almost no one knew he owned. Money, he had learned early, was only dangerous in the hands of people who mistook it for worth. In his own hands, it had only ever been a tool, one he used sparingly and only ever in defense of the people he loved. He rose quietly from the edge of the bed, careful not to wake his son, and made his way down the hall to the small kitchen of their apartment, where the light above the stove cast a warm, low glow over the counter. His phone buzzed once, a message from his assistant confirming that the transition at Callaway Tower was proceeding smoothly, that the department heads had responded well to the morning's meeting, that morale, against all odds, seemed to be lifting rather than sinking under the sudden change in leadership. He read it once, nodded to no one, and set the phone face down on the counter. Tomorrow there would be more calls to make, more decisions to weigh, more quiet, invisible work to do in service of an empire that most of the world would never know he controlled. But tonight, there was only this, a sleeping child down the hall, a quiet apartment, and the simple, steady certainty that he had done, in that lobby, exactly what needed to be done. Not for power, not for pride, but for the one small voice that had looked up at a stranger's cruelty and, without any bitterness at all, simply said he was sorry about her shoe. That, Arthur thought, switching off the kitchen light and heading back down the hall, was the only kind of empire truly worth protecting.